Karen had always measured success in deadlines met, promotions earned, and the steady hum of office air conditioning. His apartment, perched high above the smog-glazed skyline, was neat, efficient, and silent, too silent. Every morning, he buttoned his shirt, knotted his tie, and stepped into a life that looked perfect from the outside. But something had begun to fray. It started subtly. A forgotten deadline didn't spark panic. A meeting's agenda blurred into meaningless jargon. His reflection, clean-shaven, composed, looked more like a mouse than a man. At 32, Karen had a job thousands would envy. Yet he moved through his days like a ghost with a calendar. One Sunday afternoon, caught in a spell of rare idleness, he wandered to his balcony. A withering mint plant sat in a cracked terracotta pot, a souvenir from a weekend impulse buy months ago. The leaves had yellowed, the soil dry as dust. Out of reflex, he poured some water from his glass into the pot and stood there longer than he meant to. That night, he dreamed of his grandfather's farm. A real place, earth-scented, sun-drenched, alive. He remembered the feel of damp soil in his fingers, the chorus of crickets at dusk, and the gentle wisdom in his grandfather's voice. Soil remembers kindness. It had been 20 years, but the memory felt recent, vivid. When he woke, the first thing he did was check on the mint plant. It stood no taller, but it didn't look quite as brittle. The following week, between client calls and budget spreadsheets, Karen began researching, casually at first, urban farming. Growing vegetables in small spaces. How to start farming with no experience. His search history grew roots, branching into blogs, tutorials, even forums where strangers shared harvests like proud parents. The deeper he went, the louder the question echoed, what am I really growing here? At work, his productivity dipped. Not drastically, but enough that his manager asked if everything was all right. Karen smiled and lied. But something had already shifted. During lunch breaks, he found himself sketching garden layouts instead of campaign strategies. At night, he watched videos of farmers turning barren patches into green sanctuaries. He wasn't reckless. He didn't quit his job or announce a radical life change. But the decision began quietly, like all true decisions do. It stirred inside him, watered by memory and hope. One evening, he stood again at the balcony, a packet of spinach seeds in hand. The city buzzed around him, indifferent. He pressed his thumb into the soil, dropped in a seed, and covered it gently. He didn't know where this path would lead, success but for the first time in years, he felt something genuine. The steady hum of office air conditioning. The spinach sprouted after 11 days. High above the Karen hovered over it like a new parent, checking moisture levels with his finger, adjusting the pot's angle for better sunlight, even whispering encouragements when no one was around. It was a single shoot, barely an inch tall, but it anchored something in him, an intention. No longer abstract. He began rising earlier, not for work, but for research. His browser became a patchwork of tabs. Best crops for beginners. Organic soil versus synthetic. Container farming guide. His morning coffee sipped slower now. Eyes fixed on forums where strangers debated compost ratios and crop cycles. Every article he read seemed to reveal a deeper layer. Farming wasn't just planting. It was a conversation with time, patience, and unpredictability. He learned about soil pH, companion planting, irrigation types. He scribbled notes like a student before finals, highlighting words he barely understood but was determined to master. Then came the questions. Where would he actually farm? His apartment was too small, and the balcony barely fit 3 pots. Renting land was an option, but risky. He looked up rooftop farming and discovered a community initiative just 5 kilometers away. An old warehouse transformed into shared urban garden plots. When he woke, by the following weekend, Karen had signed up for a 6 by 8 foot space. But it didn't modest, but it felt like a kingdom. Walking into the rooftop garden the first time felt like stepping into a secret world. There were others like him, quiet beginners and seasoned growers, each hunched over their soil like sculptors. One woman was tending cherry tomatoes. Another man built a trellis with bamboo sticks. No one asked questions. They simply nodded as he found his patch and crouched beside it. He brought the basics, a hand trowel, gloves, biodegradable grow bags, a few seedlings he'd nurtured from his windowsill. Not the first few days were clumsy, overwatering, misplacing seeds, fumbling with fertilizer ratios. But failure didn't sting. It taught. Each evening, after his day job drained his focus, he returned to the rooftop. As the city dimmed below him, he found clarity among the soil. Still, doubt crept in. He didn't quit his job one evening, as he buried compost into the corner of his plot. He overheard two gardeners talking about fungal blight. He froze. Was that the white patch he'd seen yesterday? Panic rose in his throat. He went home that night spiraling into late-night searches, afraid his fragile progress would rot overnight. But the next morning, he returned with a plan, a natural antifungal spray, crop rotation ideas, a notebook filled with observations. The fear, he realized, wasn't about plants dying. It was about giving up before learning how to save them. His hands, once soft from keyboards, were calloused now. He carried soil beneath his fingernails like quiet trophies. Something was changing, not just in the plot, but in him. And though the harvest was months away, Karen was beginning to understand. Growth isn't measured in leaves alone, but for research. His browser became a patchwork of tabs. Best crops for beginners, organic soil versus synthetic, container farming guide. His morning coffee sipped slower now, eyes fixed on forums where strangers debated compost ratios and crop cycles. Every article he read seemed to reveal a deeper layer. Farming wasn't just planting, it was a conversation with time, patience, and unpredictability. He learned about soil pH, companion planting, irrigation types. He scribbled notes like a student before finals, highlighting words he barely understood but was determined to master. Then came the question, where would he actually farm? His apartment was too small, and the balcony barely fit 3 pots. Renting land was an option, but risky. He looked up rooftop farming and discovered a community initiative just 5 kilometers away, an old warehouse transformed into shared urban garden plots. By the following weekend, Karen had signed up for a 6-by-8-foot space. Modest, but it felt like a kingdom. Walking into the rooftop garden the first time felt like stepping into a secret world. There were others like him, quiet beginners and seasoned growers, each hunched over their soil like sculptors. One woman was tending cherry tomatoes. Another man built a trellis with bamboo sticks. No one asked questions. They simply nodded as he found his patch and crouched beside it. He brought the basics, a hand trowel, gloves, biodegradable grow bags, a few seedlings he'd nurtured from his windowsill. The first few days were clumsy, overwatering, misplacing seeds, fumbling with fertilizer ratios. But failure didn't sting. It taught. Each evening, after his day job drained his focus, he returned to the rooftop. As the city dimmed below him, he found clarity among the soil. Still, doubt crept in. One evening, as he buried compost into the corner of his plot, he overheard two gardeners talking about fungal blight. He froze. Was that the white patch he'd seen yesterday? Panic rose in his throat. He went home that night spiraling into late-night searches, afraid his fragile progress would rot overnight. But the next morning, he returned with a plan, a natural antifungal spray, crop rotation ideas, a notebook filled with observations. The fear, he realized, wasn't about plants dying. It was about giving up before learning how to save them. His hands, once soft from keyboards, were calloused now. He carried soil beneath his fingernails like quiet trophies. Something was changing, not just in the plot, but in him, and though the harvest was months away, Karen was beginning to understand. Growth isn't measured in leaves alone. July brought with it a furnace sky and an unrelenting heat that pressed against the city like a weight. The rooftop garden, once buzzing with quiet labor, grew still. Leaves wilted in defiance of Karen's efforts, and water evaporated faster than he could pour. The spinach shriveled. The tomato vines, which had started to bloom, yellowed at the tips. Something was wrong. He sat on the edge of his plot, sweat streaking dust across his face, staring at the drooping plants. It wasn't just the weather. Pests had found his garden, tiny aphids clustering beneath leaves, their damage invisible until it was already too late. Karen tried everything he'd read, neem oil sprays, companion planting, even talking gently to the plants, as if they could be coaxed back to life. But each morning revealed more damage, chewed leaves, rotting stems, black spots like ink stains spreading across green. Doubt returned with sharp teeth. Had this all been a mistake? Was he simply playing farmer while real growers battled storms, soil, and survival? At work, his performance dipped further. His manager called him in for a private meeting, offering a mix of concern and veiled warning. Karen nodded to the conversation, eyes distant, fingers tracing the dirt beneath his nails. One evening, as he sprayed a bitter mix of garlic and soap across his lettuce, a voice interrupted him. Too much soap. You'll strip the leaves. He turned to see an older man, face sun-worn, tending the next plot over. Karen had seen him before, always early, always quiet. The man stepped closer and knelt, examining a sickly plant without permission but with a practiced eye. Your soil's too wet. That's root rot. Pull it before it spreads. Karen followed the advice. One by one, he removed the failing plants. It felt like tearing pages from a book he hadn't finished. The man introduced himself as Harish. They spoke little, but enough. Harish explained how he'd lost entire seasons before learning to read the weather better than any app. He shared tips, how to test compost by smell, how to catch morning dew in shade clods. Under Harish's subtle mentorship, Karen's approach changed. He stopped reacting and started observing. He adjusted watering schedules, built makeshift shade canopies, planted marigolds to ward off pests. The soil began to recover. He still lost crops, but not the battle. The rooftop garden wasn't just soil anymore. It was memory, lesson, and persistence layered in rows. Every plant told a story of failure, adjustment, and unexpected resilience. One evening, after a hard day, Karen stood before his small plot, wind tugging at his sleeves. Among the regrowth, a single tomato hung ripe and unblemished, glinting in the twilight. It was just one, but it was enough. He picked it gently, turning it in his palm. This fragile, red sphere wasn't just fruit. It was proof. The tomato wasn't alone for long. By late September, Karen's plot was humming with quiet life, basil spilling over the edges of grow bags, spinach regrown and full, capsicum nodding like green lanterns in the breeze. His hands moved with practiced grace now, fingers brushing soil like a pianist testing keys. He no longer needed to check instructions. He knew what each plant needed. He listened with his eyes, his touch, his memory. The rooftop garden, once foreign and intimidating, had become a sanctuary, not just for plants, but for him. He began sharing his produce. A handful of lettuce to the woman who watered his plot when he was late. A basket of herbs to his neighbor who used to complain about the balcony soil smell. One Sunday, he brought cherry tomatoes and mint to his parents. His mother held the bunch as if it were a bouquet. His father, who had once scoffed at hobby farming, bit into a tomato and nodded, silent, but proud. Karen didn't speak much about the journey. He let the vegetables tell the story. Crisp, colorful, quietly defiant. But inside, a shift had taken root. He still worked his office job, still rode the same train, wore the same shoes. But the stress that once clung to him like smog had lifted. There was something steady now in his chest. Farming hadn't erased his problems, but it had redefined them. Problems were no longer walls. They were weather systems, pests, dry soil, solvable, temporary, part of the cycle. One evening, just before dusk, Karen stood at the edge of his plot. The city's chaos throbbed faintly below, like a distant drum. Above, clouds gathered in gentle streaks, hinting at rain. He inhaled the scent of basil and damp soil. Harish approached quietly, holding a bundle of lemongrass. "You've done well," the older man said, nodding toward the flourishing plot. Karen smiled. "Still learning." Harish chuckled. "We all are." They stood in silence, two farmers in a city that rarely slowed down, surrounded by green rebellion. Before leaving, Karen placed a small sign in the corner of his plot. It read, "Beginner's luck? Maybe. Beginner's grit? Definitely." He hadn't become an expert. He wasn't feeding a village. But he had grown something, with patience, with trial, with care. And in that growth, he had reclaimed a part of himself. To anyone watching, it might look small, just a garden on a roof. But for Karen, it was the start of something far bigger. A seed planted not just in soil, but in purpose.